Welcome back to the Lords of Lore podcast. I'm Matt.
I'm Luca.
I'm Will.
Welcome. We're the Lords of Lore, the podcast for all things fantasy and sci-fi nerddom. That was a weird one. We're gonna break this show down into 3 segments where we each bring something interesting to talk about in the realm of fantasy and sci-fi. And Luca will get us started with Luca's Litany Literature, wherein Luca has a podcast within the podcast and talks a little bit what's going on in his life, which probably needs an updated pitch because the format of the show has changed. However, it's fun to say in my mind. I
haven't thought of a new alliteration for my name, so
it's tough. What do you got for us this week?
I have a simple question. I was rewatching some episodes of Avatar. I know we've had this conversation before, but I don't remember. What kind of bender would you guys be?
Ooh.
I would be a waterbender.
Me too.
I would 100% be a waterbender, and I don't think there is a better vanilla bender than the waterbenders.
I agree. For people who may be watching us for the first time or newer podcast listeners, you can check out our full episode somewhere in the corner here. Hopefully I'm in the top right. But we did a whole episode on bending as a
magic system.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think in that episode, I also said I would be a waterbender. And I think I was heavily influenced by the Sword of Kaigen, which uses a similar magic system, directly inspired by Avatar. And just things like being able to create a Sasayama and just bloodbending. And water is, our lifeblood. Besides our blood, it's the next lifeblood. I don't know. I just think it's I agree with you. Vanilla bending I think waterbender is probably the most useful.
And I think earthbending is the most underrated. I think it could come in a close second.
I think, first of all, Will, what are you? What did you say?
Firebending. Man's not hot.
Hot take. Let's break it. Wait, why do you think you're a firebender? Or is it just that you want to be, that you would like to be a firebender? Or do you feel like you are? Okay, well, why? Why are those things?
There's a reason as to why the firebenders ruled supremacy in the Avatar world for
and why
a
century.
Is that? Because fire is more powerful.
Do you think you're more powerful than other people?
I mean, objectively some, but no, I'm kidding.
Like some kids.
Yeah.
Smarter than a child. Most children. I just think firebenders. I just think it's cooler. I think it's like, I don't know. I just think there's more that you could do.
Well, I disagree.
I find that there's the least you can do with firebending.
You can burn things, and that's it.
Like, you can burn people and take their stuff.
That's
sick and
twisted. I said evil. I said it as soon as you.
You sick man, dude. You are sick.
I mean, you could just compel the waterbenders to get you a glass of water.
We are learning a lot about you, Will. Yeah, I mean, you could. Is that something you'd like to do? Because I would.
Will rule supreme.
Yeah, new segment of the show. Will ruins everything. Let's get back to your underrated thing about the earthbenders.
Yeah, like
that is true.
I think maybe one of the most beautiful things about that magic system that we didn't touch on was that everything feels balanced. Like, I often think, man, airbending's pretty underrated. And then the next time I think about the system, I'm like, man, firebending is pretty good. And I think that's the beautiful thing, is that being the Avatar grants you access to all these things, which makes you, more powerful than anyone else. But, a firebender versus a waterbender, there's strengths and weaknesses to both. And, your ability to win that fight is more on you overcoming the challenges that face you as your type of bender, and becoming really good at it. Whereas, when you're fighting the Avatar, you could only be so good before my access to all these powers trumps your earthbending. You know what I mean? Because I can do that too. Yeah.
It's such a beautiful, it's simple and elegant, like the magic system. Like, I'm sure the system exists elsewhere, like elemental magic, and it's focused on the 4 elements. But like, I honestly can't think of a story that I read or heard before the Avatar that had this magic system. It's like, it just seems like, if you're thinking of like elemental magic, it seems like the go-to, like, because even something like D&D, which existed way longer, had like fire spells and like ice spells and stuff, but it didn't have like that ingrained, like, these are the elemental magics.
Yes. Yeah. The only reference I could think of before is like for me anyways, is like the Legend of Zelda having, or Ocarina of Time specifically, where you have to get the fire gem and then the water gem, and that theme sort of repeats throughout a lot of the games. But it's not like, this society uses fire. It's like, these are rock people and they live on the volcano, so they have the fire gem. But yeah, I don't know, I think, like you were talking about D&D, that made me think of like, how do you guys feel about someone having access, like, let's say it's not the Avatar, but it's a magic system wherein you're born with a certain bending ability. How do you feel about someone like the Avatar being able to do multiple things? Does that kill your enjoyment of a system like that, or does that heighten it?
Personally, I enjoy it. For me, it heightens it because I'm curious to see how that character would be used. Obviously, if that character just becomes like a plot armor, like anime protagonist type character that has like no struggles or developments, and it's like, okay, that's kind of boring. Then I'd prefer a story like the Sword of Kaigen, where you have people that are individual, like they can individually use their elements, and then there's like people within each element that are like near godlike
specialists.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm gonna have to play devil's advocate and say it kind of turns me off a bit.
Ooh, okay. Why?
I think the story might have been, I don't know. Well, that's the thing, because there's like Avatar is obviously all about balance and stuff, and like I kind of wish like none of the powers were like, I don't know. I just don't like the balance of all the bending skills. I think it would be a little bit more interesting to see like the story without someone who could use all 4 elements. But like, for example, like there are discrepancies between like a powerful water bender versus like just your average run of the mill fire bender. Like I think it would like lend to like a little bit more of a better conflict, I guess, like with like some of the fight scenes and stuff like that, like because like because everything kind of has a weakness but also has a strength over one another. But like I would kind of like to see that just removed, and everybody could just, it doesn't really matter with those weaknesses and strengths. That makes sense.
I can understand that perspective. It feels like when you have somebody who has access to all facets of the magic system, they become like the mediator.
Yeah.
Where it's like, if you want to talk to the Fire Nation, you have to do it through the Avatar, because, he gets them or she gets them, But I don't know. I think the thing that makes that show and that universe interesting is that the Avatar is always an interesting character who has to deal with adversity. Like you're saying, Luca, when it becomes like a Mary Sue type character where, it's just plot armor, I can bend my way out of anything because I know all types of bending. It's, it's not interesting anymore. But I think the cool thing about the Avatar is struggling to, master those different elements, and finding where like, waterbenders and firebenders don't see eye to eye, and I am the link between them that can, show them that they're not so dissimilar.
And I tend to like characters like that, where you have like characters that you don't interact with so much, and you know that there's some kind of elevated being, and they have certain influence on the story and have their own certain restrictions. And a very good example of that is in Malazan universe. Like there's the characters like Anomander Rake, who are these like ancient beings that have immense power, and they influence the world, but like very subtly. And whenever they act, it's like major events happen. And I've always like, I love characters like that. So that's why something like the Avatar doesn't like throw me off. If anything, if they even made the Avatar more powerful and more like oppressive, I would enjoy that. Like I think a super interesting storyline would be like an Avatar that's like a conqueror, like an Avatar that wants to be like the emperor of all the nations and sort of like forcibly unifies them. I think that would be like a super interesting story.
Like you, Will.
Yeah. Like if Will was the Avatar.
Yeah, and that's sort of the storyline of season 2 of Korra, right? Is that, is the person who's trying to become the dark Avatar and use it in sort of like not in their eyes, but in a malicious way to Korra's eyes.
Yeah. I mean, there's, I think, Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson is an example of a story that begins in a world like that, where like the Dark Lord being won and defeated the heroes. And like this first book starts like thousands of years into this being's rule over all of society. And it's like, that's the setup of the story. And that's a book I haven't actually gotten into yet. I have it. It's another one of those I've bought and haven't read yet.
Yeah. Okay. Question for you guys. If you had to choose, so I'm pitching a scenario where you don't have access to the magic system. You are just a civilian, a non-bender. And you can only pick one element that you have to live under. So you're a second-class citizen in a world that prioritizes one type of bender. Which element are you choosing?
Specifically in the world of Avatar?
Yes.
And we're talking like Avatar: The Last Airbender or Korra?
Both.
Yeah. It's like I wanted to say airbenders. Like I'd love to be just in their temples living my life, but they all got massacred in
yeah, but I mean like say it's our world. So tomorrow half the population gets one bending power. Would you want it to be fire, water, earth, or air? And we are not in that half.
Oh god.
Yeah, we also got Thanos snapped. We're the unlucky half of society.
Oh. I definitely wouldn't want to be around fire.
Okay.
100%. Like
Will?
Yeah, I'd have to say probably earth, I think.
Why would you pick earth?
It just seems like I don't know. See, that's hard because when I think of like metal benders from Legend of Korra, so like that would just be like useful to have.
Yeah, like the most practical.
Yeah, but it would also be like absolutely chaotic for somebody just to like rip apart your house if it's made out of stone or something.
Well, I guess all the elements are capable of ripping your house apart. So
true, yeah, but I guess there is like better, faster public transport with earthbending, so that'll probably be it.
Yeah, like if I'm thinking about the original series and like the cities we saw and like how they lived, I would choose the Earth Kingdom. Like I would live in Ba Sing Se.
Yeah. But what if you had to live where you currently live and there was just now element benders? Which one do you think would be the most beneficial or at least have the least impact on your life? I'll probably say waterbenders because we know they have healing properties.
And we live in a place of cold and snow.
Exactly. So, if someone who's able to remove snow, I think, you talk about public transport. I mean, if we can actually get road clearing done, like
but no potholes,
snowfall.
No earthbending.
Oh man, that's a really, really good point. Yeah.
I still think where we are now, I would choose water. I think the worst place to possibly would be anywhere where there's firebenders. Like if tomorrow people had fire abilities, I would not want to be
that's chaotic. See, and this is why I never gravitate towards firebenders, even though I think it's a balanced system. That is by far the most chaotic and the most potent for irreversible damage.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's less utility to having fire at your disposal than there is water, earth, or air. I think, but I guess you could be freezing out in the wilderness, and that would feel like a dumb statement to make. So
true, but how many times have you found yourself?
Yeah, I don't know. I've also never found myself, not having access to water. We live pretty privileged lives, I guess. But
absolutely, but you found yourself in many situations to be like, oh man, if I could like move this water just a bit, like that'd be great.
That's very true. When my shower head's pointed the wrong direction and now my bath mat is soaked, and it's like, if I could just out this, Oh man. Anyways, Will, you're wrong. And
in conclusion, Will is a monster and waterbending is the best.
You can just compel people to do what you want with fire, right?
Right.
I mean, you can compel them with anything. Like you
but if half the society has firebending, there's not much compelling going on. It's just depression.
Chaos.
Yeah, who compels who?
Fire cleanses.
Oh my gosh.
All right, before we stray into dangerous territory here with Will, I think that'll do it for.
Yeah, fair enough. So we'll jump over to Matt's meandrous mumblings. This one is meandrous as it gets. This is something I wrote down in my possible topics because I saw something online and it interested me because it was something I had never thought of. And so I'm going to let you guys into that discovery, which you might look at me funny because you're like, yeah, that was obviously the point behind that scene or storytelling device, but I never got it. So obviously Lord of the Rings, spoilers for Lord of the Rings, if people haven't seen those films or read those books. At the end of Return of the King, or towards the end, Frodo turns. He's right there in Mount Doom, about to throw the ring, and then he says no, and he doesn't. Then what happens is Gollum comes and jumps on him and bites his finger off and falls. And now that he has the ring, his journey is complete and he no longer cares about anything and falls into the fires of Mount Doom, destroying the ring and himself. And, that's how it ended. So I've always seen that scene as power corrupts. And I think, although Tolkien has said The Lord of the Rings was not meant to be allegorical at all, I do feel like there's a lot of messages and lessons to be learned. And I've always taken that scene as that even the purest of pure Frodo, who is tasked with doing this because, he was seen as one of the only people that could. He was incorruptible. Eventually, he too succumbs to the draw of power. And it's only that somebody else was further down that journey that stopped Frodo's demise. That's how I looked at it. Gollum couldn't escape what he was. And we saw that, throughout the second and third movie and book. But I had somebody point out to me that the reason why that happened isn't just because Gollum succumbed to the draw of power, but it's actually who Frodo is that saves himself in turn, because it's Frodo's idea to save Gollum's life, and out of the compassion and seeing that, they're not so different, Gollum and he, and, taking pity on the creature, in turn, it comes around that Gollum ends up saving Frodo's life, or in some fashion, or saving the entire world. It's Frodo's compassion, which was the initial point and why he was given the ring. It's because he was the only one who could do it. He was kind-hearted. He was seen as incorruptible. And it turns out that same compassion that he had is what ends up being the difference. I had never looked at it that way, that, Frodo's past deeds save him in the end when he's no longer able to act, responsibly is the wrong word, but morally just, I guess, for lack of a better word. And so, this sort of changed my whole perspective on Frodo's actions and, the tension between Sam and he, and even the relationship with Gollum, because everything that they go through from sparing Gollum's life, that's all Frodo doing the right thing and setting up, later on he'll be rewarded for that, even though that's not why he did it. He did it because it was the right thing. But, in life, there is sometimes a reward for doing the right thing. So I thought it was interesting to see that scene from a new perspective. So first, what are you guys' thoughts on that? Do you think I'm an idiot for not seeing that beforehand, or what were your initial thoughts of that scene?
No, like honestly, I've never thought about it like that either, where it's like Frodo's prior actions are what saves him later. I think like when you were talking about that, it reminded me of the scene where they first see Gollum in the Mines of Moria, and it's like Frodo says to Gandalf, like, it's a pity Bilbo didn't kill him, and like Gandalf says to him, like pity is what saved him. Like it was Bilbo's pity for him that stopped him from killing him. And then he says, like, I feel as though he still has a part to play in the story.
Right.
And then that almost, it's like every single time Frodo sees him afterwards, you kind of get that same sort of feeling he's taking Gandalf's position now. Like,
yeah.
And it's almost like their roles are reversed, where Sam has the position that Frodo had, where it's like, we should get rid of him and kill him, or like maybe not kill him, but like we should definitely not be with this guy. And Frodo's the one that like, he sees him, maybe because he's already been carrying the ring for a while, but like he sees what it's done to him, and he sees him more as Smeagol than Gollum.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas Sam is like anti.
Yeah. Sam is operating out of fear, whereas Frodo tries to have some understanding and compassion and empathy, I guess, towards Gollum or Smeagol. Yeah. Frodo's succeeding because he was an empath. Oh my god. Also, though, something Gandalf says there is like stuck with me for a long time, is that I'm paraphrasing, but some of those who are alive deserve death, and some of those who have died deserve life. Can you give it to them? And Frodo's like, oh shit, I'm the dick. But yeah, Will, what were your thoughts on that scene?
I always thought of it as just like, that's just like the center, like the magnetic pole of evil, like in Middle Earth at the time, because that's where the One Ring was created, made by like the second most evil character in the entire universe. So I just thought that like even like Frodo's, I guess, inner strength and stuff like that just couldn't withstand just being there, like even just for like a moment. Like it seemed like I just took it as it's just like he was getting hit with, I guess, like a wave of evil that was just like invisible, bad vibes all around. It's just like, and he just like, Frodo just like eased up for a second, and then that was just all it took. So that's the way I always thought. Like I always viewed it. It's just like, how could you not be corrupted in that moment, in that place, I guess. But yeah, I don't know, that's just the way I always took it. And like Smeagol jumping on his back was kind of like a distraction away from all the bad vibes.
Yeah.
See, as an empath, he was feeling.
I remember like being younger and that happening, like, so there's a thing with Pixar. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but just for writing in general, I use this same idea when I'm, running games in D&D and stuff, is that your characters can get into trouble by a coincidence, but they can't get out of trouble by coincidence. That's lazy writing. So, watching that when I was younger felt that way, in that, oh, now here's the exact moment where Smeagol betrays them and bites his finger off. That's convenient because they would have lost. When you're younger, you don't really care about those things, but that's why I sort of looked into it a little bit deeper when I was older and been like, oh, the point of the scene is to say that power corrupts ultimately. And now, having this different perspective on it, I now see it a little bit differently as well. But I think like looking at it in a way that's just like, oh, it's just like for the suspense of the moment to be like, what? They're gonna lose after all? And, oh, here comes Gollum, But now when I see it from the perspective of like it's the compassion that Frodo had before, which then comes in and saves them. Now I don't mind it because now it's no longer coincidence. It's it's because that was set up before. It's because the pity that he showed him that turns out to like you say, play a part in the story still. So I don't know. I've always loved Lord of the Rings. I always loved Gollum the character and Frodo as a character, but that scene, for whatever reason, I've always felt the need to justify it. And now I don't. I'm like, oh, that was a really good way to set it up. Either way you look at it, like Frodo does eventually succumb. And that's why at the end of Lord of the Rings, he has to leave because he's forever changed. And Tolkien saying that the Lord of the Rings is not allegorical, I think maybe he truly does believe that or did believe that. I just think that's so wrong because there's so much of it that's like points back to like his own experiences at war and stuff, and coming home as a changed person and not being able to go back to the life you once knew, whether that's metaphorical and your PTSD and trauma. But in the case of Lord of the Rings, it's I literally can't go back to the Shire and pretend everything's all right with you people. I've seen too much and I've been corrupted. I need to, go on my next journey type of thing.
I think when he was talking about allegory, it was more like he didn't write it specifically like being like orcs represent Nazi Germany, like that.
Right. Yeah.
If you find parallels, like all stories have some kind of moral, some kind of message, and like if you can find parallels in the real world, like you're creating the allegory. He just didn't intend to write it as that.
Yeah.
That's how I always understood it.
Yeah, I definitely see that's a really good understanding of that. I think I definitely see Frodo's journey as allegorical for his experience in the war. Whether that's intentional or not, I think like you're saying, like sometimes our experiences, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago where talked about like cultures and what we know shows up in what we make, whether we intended to or not. And I think just that alone, like putting something from our own lives into something, and it's not a one for one, that can become allegory.
That's like the definition.
Yeah, exactly. The tenor and I can't remember what the other word is, but that serves as that sort of device. So yeah, I just thought it was cool to look at that scene in a new way. Have you guys ever had a similar experiences with a scene or a story that you've seen in a new light years later or whatever the case is?
As you were saying that, it reminded me of a moment that just happened in Queen of Fire, which you might remember. So I'm currently, Valen has made it into the north, like into the ice, and he's met he's met the bear people and the wolf people. And there's like a scene where he has to try to convince like a large group of tribes people to join his cause. And the price that the chieftain asks in exchange for his people's loyalty is to have his woman. I don't know if you remember that scene. And instead of that, he pulls out a ruby that he's been carrying since like book one, and that his song always told him not to get rid of. And now that he like doesn't have it, he says like, I hope this is the reason. I hope this moment is the reason it told me not to get rid of this ruby. Then he gives him the ruby, and that is enough for them to like exchange for their loyalty. Right. And that was like that same kind of like something that happens in book one affecting like being a critical event in like, the end of the story. But something that I've seen multiple times that I like interpreted differently. It's a good question because I've seen a lot of things many times.
Yeah.
Will, if you have an example, you can go ahead.
Okay. So I when you mentioned it earlier, I kind of thought of it just as like when you mentioned earlier that you wanted to have this as a discussion, I kind of thought a little bit differently.
That's okay.
I thought you meant just like kind of like just understanding. Well, I guess it is kind of the same, but like I thought it was like a little bit more like how one might understand like context and stuff like that a little bit.
Yeah, it totally is. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'll also, just as a side note, I thought you were gonna like talk about like the gifts that Galadriel gives. because I see that.
Oh, you meant like subtext.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So number one, quick shout out, Jurassic Park. After reading the novel, which came before the films, helps me, like it totally changed the way that I saw it, like how the dinosaurs expanded all over the place. Novel gives a pretty good discussion about or explanation on like how that happened scientifically, which I thought was pretty cool. Also, because Michael Crichton's like an ultra genius, R.I.P.
Ultra genius.
Yeah, he was like a doctor and a lawyer and a bunch of other stuff all within a few years. The other one actually is Dune. And like I don't want to
no book spoilies before.
No,
just in case.
Yeah. Okay, so no, it's not a book spoil. It's just like so. I actually just rewatched the movie last night because I just got it on disc, the Denis Villeneuve copy. But I was watching like this film analysis, dude. It was on YouTube. Can't remember shout outs, but you're like I don't know, buried in my YouTube history, which is a demonic garbage pile. So, but I can't remember your name.
Why firebenders were right.
Justified. The firebending expansion was justified. No, he mentioned that there was like a shift in tone between the book and the movie. Because one of the reasons why Frank Herbert made the book was kind of like he made it so that like so people would like kind of like second guess like charismatic leaders. And in the movies, like one of the opening lines, it's like the second line where Zendaya's Chani kind of mentions when she's talking about like the history of Arrakis. This guy noted that Denis Villeneuve kind of focused more on the oppression as like a tone as opposed to like the feudal battles and like warring as opposed like that we see in the books more. And like it kind of made me think because like I mean throughout the again I don't want to go like too far and too deep into it, but like we focus so much like on like Zendaya drops that line. It's like the second line in the movie, but the rest of the movie where I think like we see Paul as like this kid and stuff like that, and there's a lot of foreshadowing and stuff that we hopefully get to see in later movies. But like it completely changed the way when I rewatched the movie. Because like even though like House Atreides and like all of the retainers and all that stuff like that, even though they are like great people, there is still like there's not that much of a difference between them and the Harkonnens because they're still like basically just continuing the same resource extractions. And like there's a line where Duke Leto's like, we still have to get like 50 like silos of spice out of here like within the same time frame as like the Harkonnens did. So
right,
it kind of like it just kind of changed the way how I saw the movie.
Yeah, even a good sort of example of recontextualizing things is reading Dune and the I don't know what you call them, little excerpts that are before every chapter, and they take like a retrospective look back at the story that we're reading in real time, and it's never good. It's always mistrust and traitorous sort of rhetoric around, here's where the people who were around this person went wrong. This is how they believed him and they were wrong to do so. This is how this person betrayed this person, or this is the lie that this person told, and this is how you have to be aware of those. Which is like, I understand for the movie, and again, I think the film is perfect, but when you're selling it to a new audience, and you're trying to make something that's entertaining over a trilogy, there needs to be setup. We can't know how this thing wraps up before we start, right? So to go into that movie and being like, man, Paul is the sort of protagonist and the person we root behind, it's because, in movies 2 or 3, the rug's going to get pulled out from under the audience, and we're going to see like characters like this, or more so individuals with this sort of way of thinking and manipulation. In when you talk about like how the Bene Gesserit set up what they're about to do, it's a cautionary tale more than it is one of heroics and of a protagonist to like be inspired by or admire. It's more like these are why individuals that do this type of stuff are dangerous. This is why you should avoid people who claim to be the Messiah or claim to, or scapegoat people or whatever the case may be. It's because when you read it, you're like, what a hero, until the rug gets pulled under you. You're like, oh shit, I would have been one of those people who blindly followed this person because they said cool things.
Yeah. And like when I saw that in this unnamed YouTube video that this guy mentioned, shout out, he I
think it was Keep Making.
Might have been, yeah.
Just kidding.
Like I don't think that like that topic of like, I guess, oppression is like brought out again. I don't think it's mentioned whatsoever, because like Zendaya is like, I wonder who will our oppressors be next, and then like cut to like
Paul.
Yeah, Paul just like waking up. Yeah. And like for me, it just changed the entire way I saw the movie, and I just thought it was like, it's like something that like you can't unsee, or at least for me, especially like near the end with the fight with Jameis. And he's like, I have to do this. And it's like, well, do you really? And also like, like the whole city of Arrakeen just got like fucking air stricken, and like this wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for this system that's put into place of like feudal houses and stuff like that. So yeah, like you imagine like living on Arrakis, A, would suck, but then also B, like your house gets nuked by like Harkonnens.
Yeah, people you've never, but I mean, it's like that really happens to people in the real world. Like, I don't care about side A or B, or especially when you talk about the sort of governing system in Dune. I don't care about individual A and individual B. I give two fucks. I don't even know their names. They just come here and they take our stuff. We don't like them, and if we rebel against them, they kill us. So I just keep my head down and okay, it's Sunday night. I'm going to bed, and boom, my whole entire block has been destroyed because Buddy A doesn't like Buddy B. And not even that those two guys had a feud between each other. It's these two guys' grandfathers. One of them said something disrespectful 100 years ago, and for the past 100 years, my whole family, generations of my family, have had to suffer for it. It's like, that's an allegory for sure. Like, no ifs, ands, or buts around it. But I feel like all of Dune is allegorical, and in that way, it's like Frank Herbert being like, here's all the shitty things that have happened in recent human history. Let's put some, space in there and make people see things from a new perspective for once. It's been really cool to read Dune and not just see it for the sci-fi experience that it is, like the epic scale of it, but also see it as, wow, this is really potent cautionary tale.
Yeah, I've been loving the book. Like, for me, the book so far, like what the movie did for sci-fi cinema, the book is doing for like my experience of sci-fi literature, just on a way bigger scale.
Yeah.
But for me, a movie that I saw, and after talking to you guys, The Green Knight.
Right. Yeah.
For me, was just like completely recontextualized as like, oh, okay, so none of the things we saw actually really happened if you kind of think about it. Like, I still haven't gone through my second rewatch, but like after we talked about it, I was like, okay, yeah, this entire movie is symbolic. Like,
yeah.
Like, I was taking things so literally because that's just how I was like experiencing it the first time. I was like, oh, these fantasy creatures are real, and just taking it at face value. Then talking about it is like, all of these things are just completely symbolic, and it just recontextualized everything that happened and like changed the character of Garwin for me completely.
Yeah, that was one too where it's like obviously like you're saying, Lugo, you go through it the first time and you're taking everything, because especially when it's a fantasy, like for us, we're ready to buy in whatever fantasy you put down. If it's weird or strange or divergent, it's like, yeah, I'm in. I'm like, show me what you got. And so when you get a movie like that one where it's so bizarre and so jarring and so discordant and disconnected. You're like, is this how this is supposed to be? And then, when you have, the I guess the revelation that like, oh, this is all symbolism and metaphor, then it's like, oh, okay, so the world that I know is not that much different from what I'm seeing on screen. I'm just seeing hallucinations or projections or whatever the case may be. Then you have to take back all that, high epic fantasy that you think you're going into, right? Mm-hmm. Because of what you see in like the trailers and even what you're seeing on screen is like, this is very epic stuff. But when you pull it back and you get that sort of explanation that like, yeah, none of this is really going on, then it sort of opens it up for even more dissection where it's like, oh, wow. Then what are those symbolism? Like, what does it mean then? And not just in the context of the film, but as the filmmakers, like, what is the intent here? So, yeah, that one was super interesting as well.
Yeah, it's definitely one I need to go back and rewatch just to like see how I feel about it now that I like see how I see the symbolism and like what I get out of it, just knowing that I shouldn't be like, I should be watching for like those small details. Like, so that is definitely one that I need to go back and it'll definitely be recontextualized.
Nice. But yeah, that'll do it for the meanders mumblings. Will, what are you wondering about this week?
Wondering. We're gonna keep surfing that Dune wave.
When he
okay, yeah, so again, like a pretty close to finishing the book, rewatched the movie and stuff last night. One of the things that popped up to me, which I really liked about the universe, is the way that, like, I guess, like how these governing factions are explained. And I think that's super underrated. So it got to me thinking about like other, I guess, fantasy / sci-fi IPs. So I guess what I'm wondering why is how come we don't often see, I guess, how these like government structures are explained. Like it's something that we don't really see, or like I haven't really seen in, I guess, fantasy, especially sci-fi, maybe not as much, but like I think Game of Thrones did it pretty well, where they explain like kind of how this feudal system works. I mean, with the whole Iron Throne and all this stuff like that, and in Dune we have like the Landsraad, which is like, I guess, this legislative body, but we also get to see more so in the book, like how like the Chom Company works, which I thought was pretty interesting. Quite convenient how Denis Villeneuve in his giant movie studio left out the whole corporate structure thing. Ill to be capitalism.
Well, I think that's the answer to your question. Is those things don't translate to film. Like, look at Star Wars Episode 1, right? Yeah. By far the most ridiculed part of those movies are the politics are done awfully. Like, not only are they super fucking racist, but also not interesting. Like, it's by far the worst opening crawl of any Star Wars film. The taxation of trade routes, blah blah blah. Yo, what? I'm sorry, who? Like, no one fucking cares. But for me, that stuff is interesting because, again, especially the three of us here, we're the Lords of Lore. We are diving into these deep sort of nooks and crannies of fantasy worlds. The world building is especially important to our enjoyment of fantasy and sci-fi. But I think for a general audience, when you go to the Star Wars movie, you want to see the dudes doing the flips with the laser swords and the guns, right? And the spaceships. You don't really care about the taxation on trade routes in the Outer Rim. Like, that's just not something that's interesting. And I think, I don't think the Game of Thrones structure of governing is that intricate at all. I think it's interesting but I think the reason why we don't see it in fantasy in film is because it doesn't sell. I think the reason why you don't see it in fantasy novelization or storytelling is because it's going back to that being inspired by medieval times. It's not that complicated. You got a guy who's in charge and he lives in the big place with all the hard walls, and everybody else sort of pays taxes to that person, and he might answer to even richer guy who lives in a bigger place with bigger walls, and has more people to command. So I think Game of Thrones falls under that medieval fantasy. The interesting parts come in when you're dealing with people from, was it Dorne? Yeah, when those people are a little bit different, they have a different governing system, or this governor is actually not a dick, oh, he's dead, it doesn't matter. But I feel like the interesting part of Game of Thrones is the characters who are vying for control. The control itself is just like any other monarchy system, I guess.
Like the Game of Thrones system is the pure feudal system, and like it's explained well, and it's used very interestingly, like with all the different houses. And like you said, in most fantasy setups, it's the feudal system, so there's not much to explain, and it's a little boring to keep explaining. But then, for example, something like the Rage of Dragons, which invents its own completely unique system of governance, it requires that explanation. But even like Rage of Dragons, it's not overly complicated. It's like you replace a king with a queen and a patriarchy with a matriarchy, and then you you add the magic system into how the government works.
I think that's a key point, Luca, is that when we're in a fantasy world, there's chemical X that we're putting into it. How does the magic system affect the governing system? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think the problem Star Wars ran into is that the magic system doesn't at all affect the governing system. It's very similar to how a governing system in the real world might work, but it's in space, and that doesn't innately make it more interesting. If anything, it's like, why the fuck are we bothering with taxations on trade routes? I understand it as like a device to explain the situation we're in, but probably could have done it in a better way than open and crawl. But
these hyperspace lanes are being blockaded. See, like I kind of like it when it's fleshed out like the way it is in Dune, because the way I see it is like this system just explains as to why, like, I guess, like the society in that universe is the way it is. But I also like it how it's used as like a vehicle for like conflict, I guess. Yes, there's like this feudal system in Dune, but like I wouldn't really call it a feudal system, because like even though that's what they call it in universe, it's not really. Like, I mean, like you have that legislative body and like I guess this overarching galaxy like corporation thing, which I thought was like pretty interesting, that like that plays such a massive role. And like I kind of like the way it's done in Dune, because it's such like a very like intricate balance of power. Like, for example, like with like the Landsrat, like the emperor, like the ruling house has X amount of votes, but like the great houses have another X of a larger amount of votes. But like there's this checks and balance system, which is like why, which like helps explain as to why there's like the War of Assassins is a thing in the Dune universe, which is like kind of cool. Like it explains as to like why there's like these weird rules of engagement that are kind of like allowed, instead of just like everyone be like, no, that's bad. But it's like a way to like handle conflict without upsetting the balance of it, like everything else. As opposed to like Game of Thrones, which is like, I'll kill everyone and just take over your lands and etc. And like I think that's what kind of helps flesh out like these fantasy worlds and sci-fi worlds as well. I think Star Wars just took a massive L because they just didn't explain like anything. But like even like Warhammer 40K, like there is like explanations as to like how like planetary governance works, and like how there's like the High Lords of Terror and stuff like that. So
I think in sci-fi, like the scale of it makes those kind of conversations more fascinating. Like putting a feudal system in a galaxy like the Dune universe, where it's like a great house rules an entire planet or multiple planets, versus like Game of Thrones, one of the great houses rules a certain territory on one continent. Like the scale of it makes it so much more interesting and complicated, and when it's pulled off brilliantly, like in Dune, is just endlessly fascinating. But I do have a fantasy story that is almost entirely driven by its politics and political system, and that is the Goblin Emperor, which I have talked about many times. I love it. I've heard it. I mean, I've read it or listened to it a dozen times. Like one of my favorite books of all time already. It's like it follows the character who becomes the emperor and his journey through like his first year as emperor. So it's half the political story, half his personal story, and it's beautiful.
Yeah, like another, I guess, fantasy IP that I think of is Fable 3, the video game.
Where you're the king?
Well, you spend like half of it. Like the first half is you're trying to overthrow your brother, who is like this king / emperor, I guess. But then like once you get in the second half, you actually have to like, once you like depose of the ruler, now it's like, now what? How do we do this? How do we handle like this oncoming threat? And like, how will you do it? Which I thought was like, I remember like playing for the first time. I was like, fuck that. Like, responsibility. That video game, what the fuck?
Well, Dragon Age Inquisition.
Yeah. Like I don't know. Like I said, it's just I kind of appreciate it more when it's explained a lot better, as opposed to like Star Wars, where it's just there's bajillions of people in a room, and apparently it's just the Senate and that's it.
Yeah. See, even with Star Wars, like the concept of the Galactic Senate is interesting because again, it sort of parallels the real world in like something like the UN, right? And it seems like a natural progression that if you went from a feudal system and then, with the technological advancements of hyperspace travel or space travel in general, like eventually you have to get to a point where everybody's communicating in a way that serves everybody's best interests where they can be. And I think, as we know, Star Wars being very influenced by Dune, I think the Trade Federation and stuff like that was a way to sort of, and like the guild and stuff. It's like it was a way to sort of, you do need some sort of way to have a blockade happening on Naboo. Like it can't just be like we're invaders, because if you're invaders, then we just destroy you and that's it. When there's something at stake, if the Senate openly attacks or deploys soldiers to attack the Trade Federation, when they've only done a blockade, that creates a ripple effect that could destroy the entire Senate. That itself is interesting because you have to work within those confines. But to explain taxation on trade routes is just not. It's just, even if the setup is coming from a place of this eventually will make this more interesting or create some sort of tension, it was not the right way to go about it. And then it hardly gets referenced and we're on to the next thing. The real interest is, by episode 3, the way we see Palpatine influence the Senate and we see his finger has been on all these things that have happened. That's where it becomes interesting, but it wasn't interesting the whole way. And I think that's where it falls short. One that's interesting despite everything I've just said is the system from Naruto, like with the Hokages or the Kages, I should say. Like their economic and political system doesn't really make sense. Like I know in universe, like they get paid to do ninja stuff, but everybody does ninja stuff. So like you only get paid by like smaller villages who, how do they get paid? By like doing like building bridges, for example, or like harvesting food or whatever the case is.
Industrial war complex.
They need protection from the other ninja places because those are places I've been hired to attack them or whatever the case is. It's always weird and it doesn't really matter. But the interesting things that come out is how the leaders react to certain things or where you can and cannot say something because it jeopardizes your position within that governing system. That's where it becomes interesting. And I feel like that's what Game of Thrones nails is that it's not really you being the king is not the interesting thing. It's how now everybody reacts to you and the power that you have. Whereas I think in some fantasies, holding the position is sometimes more interesting, right? When you look at like something like Doctor Strange, I'm the Sorcerer Supreme, which grants me different powers and different control over things. That's interesting. But we don't really learn about the hierarchy of the sorcerers in Doctor Strange because that part's not really interesting. And if it becomes relevant, then we would learn about it and it could be interesting. But, I think, again, Luca, going back to what you were saying, when there's a magic system and that, affects the governing system, then that becomes interesting. When we deal with things like the Fey Court and there's just these weird arbitrary rules like only gnomes can go to this glade where we get our jewels that we use in a certain ceremony to, have our ties with the dwarves that provide our smithing. And these certain things have to be in place. And these people have to have positions of power because if any of these things fall short, the entire magic and governing system crumbles. And that's where stories become interesting because you create that governing and magical system and then you take one of the elements out and now that's the problem the story's about. But I feel like when you just have a magical world, you go, here's a governing system. It's like, okay, okay, like cool. And so I feel like that's why a lot of fantasies feel generic and like there's a king and he has guards and it's like, okay, cool. Yeah. Well, where's the story here? And that's the interesting part.
Yeah, I guess another fantasy universe that also comes to mind would be The Witcher, especially with the books, with like the early wars between the North and Nilfgaard. But I mean, even in the TV show, we get to see like a summit of all the Northern kings a few times, and they're just basically like, how do we respond to this? But it's kind of, I do like The Witcher because you get to see a little bit more of like how these, like it's not just like a king making a ruling, but you actually get to see like basically everyone's lives just go to shit because of it. And like it immensely affect the context of like the setting, especially with like The Witcher 3, like when you're in the territory of Velen, which is just basically this no man's land, which is just this swampy, shitty hellscape that people are trying to farm in. But yeah, I guess number one lesson would be hit maxes and avoid taxes.
Oh my God.
Speaking of political systems and governance systems intertwined with magic, I can't help but mention Malazan again, which just does this like masterfully, honestly, beautifully. And another phenomenal one is the Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson. He introduces a number of very interesting political systems in the various countries that are in the world. And all of them, I mean, almost all of them have something to do with some kind of magic because their currency has to do with magic in the Stormlight Archives. With like the storms that happen, they like charge gems with essentially power that's used to make other things or create things spontaneously. It's like a system that's integrated into every aspect of life. And he has a lot of very interesting systems of governance that are either directly related to the magic or have some kind of response to the magic system. So they are out there, like, especially modern fantasy has been doing a very good job of taking that vanilla feudal sort of setup and then giving it something to elevate it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like you mentioned before, like the Burning and Rage of Dragons and stuff, it's different enough where it still comes from that same system, but the slight changes because of the world they live in make it more interesting. Give individuals within that feudal system more power because they not only are a substantial part of the governing system, but also the magic system.
Well, there's a great example out of the Raven Shadow trilogy with the Alpiran Empire, and their emperor has like the innate ability to recognize somebody's future potential. And that's how they choose the next emperor or empress, is by naming somebody, a random citizen, the Hope, and they will become the next leader of the nation. But like the emperor can only see that somebody has some kind of potential to be great, but not in which way. Yeah. So like I thought that was just like such an interesting
Hope like, killer.
I love it.
Man, I'm so glad you're enjoying that series.
That's how we get Will's fire escape.
yeah. Oh, great, the terrifying, terrible way.
Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to mention this. The more interesting political part about episode 1 of Star Wars is that the Naboo people elect a queen who's underage. That's infinitely more interesting than the trade taxation routes.
Yeah.
Like, why the fuck did they do that? They never explained. They elect a 14-year-old to rule their land.
Yeah.
I don't know, fucking, it's weird. And then that individual is not even the representative to the Senate.
Yeah, it's more of like a head of state.
Yeah, it's like a figurehead who has complete power. It's like, what the fuck? I don't know. But maybe the Naboo people, like, what would be interesting is if on Naboo, that planet specifically, and the people who were born there, I don't get Nabiri maybe, or maybe that's the last name. Anyways, if they reach maximum, what's the word? Composure levels at the age of 14. If that's like made a reference, and it's like, oh, then that would make sense why they elect this person. But right now, and I just said I like arbitrary governing rules. This is one that like doesn't fall in line with the rest of the galaxy. This is like a weird thing. It's like, and it's never explained. It's like super strange.
Yeah. You imagine if I got elected at 14, that's even bigger fire escape.
Yo.
Yeah. Oh God. Oh, I can't imagine that. It'll keep me up at night.
But again, and also, I guess more onto that point is it's an election, but it's also a monarch at the same time.
You elect the queen.
Yeah.
Which is cool.
Just strange.
I didn't vote for you.
Yeah, the
queen.
guard man just pulls out. It's like it's January 6th. I didn't vote for you.
Oh my God. Yeah, all the Sith Lords show up at the Naboo Palace on January 6th. Anyways. Oh. So has that put an end to your wondering, Will?
Yeah, definitely.
Nice.
Definitely.
Well then, yeah, we'll wrap up the show. That was fun. I am powering my way through Dune. I have had a lot going on, so I just got to book 2, I think. Luca, where are you at?
I'm behind you. I've been just blazing through the Raven Shadow trilogy.
Yeah.
I'm almost done Queen of Fire.
Are you gonna immediately jump to the Raven's Blade?
I've been thinking about I need to finish Dune because we need to ruminate on it. So I'm like, the time I'm spending listening to these books, I need to finish Dune, and then I'm gonna dive into Raven's Blade.
Nice. I actually just got a friend of mine too to start reading Bloodsong.
Nice.
So like, it's happening. Yeah, slowly but surely, everyone will become a fan of this thing. And then we'll talk off camera. But yeah, so for you guys watching and listening, be prepared for the Dune rumination coming soon.
The Dunimation.
The Dunimation, if you will.
Sounds more like
the
an animated
Yeah.
Dune movie.
Ooh. Yeah. As always, I am Matt.
I'm Luca.
I'm Will.
And we are the Lords of Lore.